Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for coming today. I'm Molly Starback, Director of the Office of Postdoctoral Services, and I'd like to welcome you to our second panel discussion in our series on the academic job search. This series is co-sponsored by my office, by the Graduate School, and by the Duke Career Center. Upcoming events in the series include how to construct your CV, cover letter, research and teaching statements, negotiating the job offer, that's always a popular one, and the tech-savvy job search. So for dates and times, please go to the Postdoc Services website, or you're probably all on various email lists so you get some notices about these. So today's discussion is on the academic interview, and many of you submitted questions in advance. Thank you for doing that. Some of the questions kind of bled over into negotiating, but today we're going to focus on the interview strictly, and then we will get to the questions on negotiating in the next panel, which will be on Tuesday, September 22nd, from 9 to 10 a.m. in room 143, Jones Building. So I'll also ask if you have questions that you keep them general in nature rather than your very specific circumstances. We will leave time at the end, so we'll stop at 10:15 so that if you have very specific questions that are just relevant to you, you can ask them to the panelists afterwards. And now I'd like to thank our panelists for taking time out of their schedules to join us. We really very much appreciate you coming this way to share your advice with our postdocs and graduate students. Thank you. And today our panelists are Nicholas Heaton, Assistant Professor of Molecular Genetics and Microbiology, Amanda Randalls, Assistant Professor of Biomedical Engineering, Jennifer Roizen, Assistant Professor of Chemistry, rhymes with poison, I will never forget that. The first time
it works really well.
Yeah. And Anne-Marie Pendergrast, who is the Professor and Vice Chair of Pharmacology and Cancer Biology, is running a little late today, but she will be joining us. So I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves and briefly talk about how they've been involved in the faculty interview process, and then we'll start with the questions that were submitted online. So Jenny, would you like to start?
Sure. So I am entering my third year as an assistant professor at Duke, which means a couple of years ago, most of my life was focused on the academic interview process, and so I have experience from that. And more recently, one of the things that some departments of Duke do is allow or engage assistant professors as sort of consultants to hiring committees. And so I've also served in that role, which means I've gotten to see a lot of what happens behind the scenes of these kind of things. So I can answer questions from both of those perspectives.
Yeah, I'm Amanda, and I just started in July, so I went through the academic interview all last year. And now I'm actually already on the committee, search committee from BME, so I kind of talked to both sides as well.
I'm Mary Pendergast. I'm a professor and vice chair of the Department of Pharmacology and Cancer Biology, and I'm also the director of graduate studies for the Molecular Cancer Biology program.
I'm Nick. I started about a month ago here at Duke, so I'm very, very recent. I haven't been involved in any search committees here, but I went on a lot of interviews over the past year, so I can tell you what worked and what didn't.
Great, I would love to hear that. So can you tell us, just to start, how the interview process is structured? Do most institutions start with a screening interview by phone and then bring candidates in, or brought in right off the bat for a first interview?
I didn't have any pre-phone interviews. In my experience, you put together you put together your application packet, right? I know that some schools would call, like, my mentor or people that they knew me before offering me an interview. But essentially all the schools follow the same format where they ask me to come out for a first interview, and they interview a bunch of candidates, and then there's a second round of interviews. And then essentially if you're their top choice, you come back for a third kind of negotiation final interview.
Yeah, that's pretty much what the experience is, that most of the time for academic positions at least is they want to see the person come in and present their work, and the phone part is usually done with the mentor or other faculty references, people in the field. that they have an opinion on the candidate?
So it actually depends a lot on the type of school you interview at. So I was looking at both Research One institutions and small liberal arts colleges. And in about 80% of the cases where I ended up going to a small liberal arts college to interview, there was a either phone or Skype interview in advance. And of all of the places I had some form of interview that were R1 institutions, only 2 of them had phone interviews in advance. I presume most of them called mentors. And not just mentors, but anyone they thought might know me that they trusted not to talk to me about it. Which sometimes they age well and sometimes the person would just tell me. So you have to be aware that narrowing down the final question of who's going to be interviewed, there is a process that goes on that you have no control over that may involve phone calls to other people.
Yeah, I had kind of a varied experience. Like some of the schools did do the initial phone screen, and like I did a Skype call with a few of them. And then depending, like I was interviewing in computer science, mechanical engineering, biomedical engineering, depending on which department it was, a lot of like the computer science and mechie, there was only one interview, like one weekend, and then you got your offer and you could come back. The second meeting was really just to see the school and have them kind of leave on that side, versus like in Duke's BME, they were the only ones that actually for me required a second interview, where we had the chalk talk on the second one. So it kind of really depended on the school. And then you were allowed, like with the Duke version, you were allowed, I could come back for a third interview where I could bring my husband and do the negotiating side. But in other schools, it was really just a 2-step process.
And what's the difference between research talk, job talk, chalk talk, interview? Like we hear all those terms thrown around.
Well, I have been in many of the committees that select faculty over the years at different levels, assistant, associate, and full professor. And the job talk is primarily a large audience, students, people from postdocs, people from other departments to come, and is to present the body of work that the individual has done in a manner that is easily understood, but really highlights the important contributions to the field and how it moves forward. And at the very end, if it is a job talk, usually they say at the very end, what are their future goals? Especially if it's a young assistant professor, they usually put in there like just one slide with 3 or 4 major areas that they're going to explore to kind of give the idea to the people in the audience where the field is going to take this person, or where the person is going to take the field. And the chalk talk is usually done just for the department, and chalk talk means without the computer, without PowerPoint, and it's pretty much a kind of a more interactive question and answer to try to see how the person thinks in their own, because especially for assistant professors, they come from labs, and usually if you come to Duke, they come from a very high-powered lab. So the question is the body of work that this person is presenting their own idea, or is their mentor's idea that they have just happened to done a portion of, but it's really the mind of the mentor that went into the project. And the job of the assistant professor or candidate is to convince the faculty that this particular project or projects were pretty much driven by the individual rather than just being an extension of the thinking of this famous person that they work for. So that's the more interactive questions, making sure that it's hypothesis driven, and how do you think on your own, and if there's challenges, how will you assemble the first R1 run, that kind of stuff.
So I'm going to tweak that answer just slightly, which is to say, it sounds like you're in a field where you take your research with you to your faculty position, and I'm in a field where you don't take your research with you. And so what you're doing during a chalk talk or during, in our case in the chemistry department, it ends up being a PowerPoint presentation, but it is closed to anyone who's not faculty. And many of the goals of that talk are the same. You're presenting your ideas, but you're presenting, in the case of chemistry, often ideas that have not been tested before. And so you're basically showing what your program will look like, people there expect to get out of it, what's the first experiment that's going to be run in your lab, what is the big picture impact, who might fund it, is it hypothesis driven, what happens when you fail, how are you going to fail quickly. It's sort of a way to field test or to test how the candidate thinks on their feet, how they interact with people, but also how deeply have they thought about their own individual program. So a lot of the goals are the same, but because it's distinct from the body of work you carried out as a postdoc or as a graduate student, you don't need to demonstrate that that's not the time to demonstrate that the work during your postdoc or your graduate work was your own. That's the time to demonstrate that you're a creative problem solver who has picked a good question, is hypothesis driven, and can carry their own weight when faced with people who are asking challenging questions and knows what they're talking about.
I would add, like, when you're going through the interview process, there's usually someone from the university, like from the department that's like a contact person running the interview. You want to ask them what the format is at that school, because some of the schools will allow you to have PowerPoint, some won't, like some expect you to have it, some don't want you to have it for the chalk talk. So you really like feel comfortable asking them, like here I talked to Craig Enriquez and he walked through, this is exactly what we expect out of the chalk talk. Which was incredibly helpful because it did vary a lot between schools. In some schools, when they say chalk talk, they might mean we want to see how you're, like in smaller, like those teaching institutions, they actually want to see a practice lecture of how you would teach something. So you want to just make sure you know what they mean, because sometimes they all say chalk talk and they actually mean something slightly different. I think other pieces, some of the advice I had was that during the chalk talk, I think kind of point out ways you might collaborate with other people in the department. And then you can get them more engaged in your chalk talk, and because it's a great point to bring people in and kind of talk to them, like bring them into the discussion. That tends to go over really well.
Yeah, that's a great idea. One of the bad signs is when a person comes in to interview and they only talk about their own stuff, but they could care less about anything that is going on around them. So that is not a good sign, because then the people that are doing the interviewing think, so how is this person going to fit into the department, and if this person is not interested in anything that is going on here, why would they even come here? So that's an important point.
There's a subtle point there, which is it's easy to walk into a room and say, I'm going to work with this person on this, and this person on this, and this person on this. And you don't want to do anything that's that presumptuous, right? You may say something like, this side of my program might work really well with somebody who's working on this, and from what I understand, this faculty member in your department has interest in this area, and I'm looking forward to talking to them and seeing if there's room. But you don't want to say, I'm definitely going to work with this person, or say anything that's so presumptuous, because a lot of people's programs
change,
evolve, and so depending on how well you know.
But at least to show that you have actually even at least read something about the faculty, so that way you can engage them and also see that there are points of common interest.
I can go back a bit to kind of how it's important to distinguish your research if you're going to continue in kind of the veins that you've been doing in your postdoc, which, at least in my field, kind of the biomedical sciences, microbiology, immunology. One of the biggest questions is, are you going to compete with your boss? Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, that's really what they care about, because you're trained to do your boss's research program, right? Except he or she already does it way better than you with like 40 people, right? So when I gave my chalk talk, the advice I got and what I think worked well for me was my published work I kind of got over very quickly, right? Highlights, 1 or 2 slides, citation at the bottom. Focused maybe 40% of the talk on unpublished but work that had already been done, things that I was putting together into papers. And then about the last third, really kind of, here's areas that I'm planning on going into, here's some preliminary data for it, kind of leading them into the chalk talk. So no experimental design, but you know, we've seen this, here's cool implications of that, here's why it matters, these are areas that we're going to go, and then literally say, you know, I have my aims and my chalk talk, we can come back to that, you know, at that time. But I would get questions. Some schools do it differently. Some kind of save the nitty-gritty of like the so what now questions for your chalk talk. Some do it in the interviews, but I would get questions after I had finished my data presentation like, all right, so if you proceed with these aims, who's your biggest competitor? Right? What are they doing right now? Right? How is yours different than that lab? What's your boss going to do? So I think kind of having that in your mind, and it's an underlying theme on all of these, how are you going to exist? How are you going to define yourself as a lab and as a scientist? You know, whether you're bringing it forward or not, how are you going to establish yourself?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And in the biological sciences, because so much is built on a body of work that kind of is like a building that is going up, and you need all these reagents and mouse models and new techniques that you're developing. So it's not like you could start from scratch like in chemistry, but in here you really depend a lot on the floors that have been established before. Is really important to take into consideration the points that Nicholas just made. But one important point is that when you get to a lab, just as a practical matter, things happen that takes you in different directions. So for example, when I came to Duke, my mentor and myself, we were working on leukemias. But my mentor quickly veered into prostate cancer, and I continued on leukemias, and then I did everything that I wanted to do in leukemias and went into a completely different area, developmental biology, and then other types of solid tumors. So you never know. Science is like when you're doing your research, you find yourself at a lot of intersections, and then you ask at this point, what branch am I going to take? And usually it takes you to unexpected places. So it ended up being that I never ended up competing with my mentor after all, even though we were initially in the same field. And when the question always came up, my mentor also worked in a very high-power lab before he started his own lab, the lab of David Baltimore at MIT. And so everybody asked him, so like, what if you ask, you know, the same question? And he used to say, well, if you're asking boring questions and that nobody else is going to do, that's kind of like irrelevant research. You have to ask big questions, and chances are that somebody else is going to ask the same questions. So it's a matter of your own contribution to the field, your own angle, etc. So he always had a good answer to that, being from Brooklyn like he was. So he had a good answer. But I think it's surprising that you think that you may end up competing, but chances are that you could always find angles that are completely different from the mentor. And remember that there also will be most likely other people from that same lab that are going out and into their job markets and to their own labs, and they may end up competing with you more than your mentors.
Right, okay. So in addition to the research talk, the job talk, the chalk talk, I mean, you're there for a whole day, day and a half, right? So what about the rest of the time? You have to go to dinner with people, you have to go to lunch with people. How important is that part?
I think, go ahead.
Hugely important. What kind of answer do you want?
I guess, like, could you talk about that part? Like, do you typically have lunch with the students and dinner with the search committee, or?
Yeah. Usually they try to have students and meet sometimes postdocs, and then the dinner usually with faculty members. And I think at that point, as a member of a committee, you're looking at how interactive this person is, how their communication skills are, you know, in terms of engaging the audience, and all those traits are very important, I think.
And I do ask, like when you have, the first time you have lunch with students, they will ask the students what they thought of you. Yeah. So they're not going to hire you just because the students liked you, but they can be a negative on that side. So make sure you really do take that part seriously as well. And if they don't put it on your schedule to talk to students, I would ask to have that put on your schedule to see if like you can ask for things to be put on, and trying to have a meeting with the students. You can often learn a lot more about the program. Like there were some institutions where the students were much more open and told me a lot about what was going on that I wouldn't have been able to pick up just from meeting with the different professors. And it also looks like you're really, like, it shows that you're more interested in like developing students and all of that. So it's good on all ends, but you'll typically end up learning a lot more from actually meeting with the students, especially if you go somewhere where the other faculty aren't. Like I have a few lunches where it'd be like in a separate room where it'd be more of a private discussion and the students felt a little bit more open with me. And then you have dinner with people, like with different faculty members, and usually, I don't know what that's useful enough, but like you do meet throughout the day. At one point, just when you're going through all of this, someone suggested at some point is to put like granola bars or something in your bag, because depending on when they schedule your lunch, there are chances you might not get to eat as much or not. Like you might not get time. And like here we had like the girl who helped run the BME search was amazing, would show up with coffee for me when they would walk me between sessions. But that doesn't, you don't always have time for that kind of thing. So having just like a granola bar or something in your bag is actually really useful.
And if you happen to be addicted to iced tea or coffee, it's not a bad idea to have some sealable container that fits into your computer bag and can go around with you, so that you can consume your illegal addictive stimulants as you normally would. The other thing I would say is, so every school is different in terms of their interview format, right? Fundamentally, every school I went to, I had dinner with faculty. That is part of the interview, right? It's an informal part, and you have to figure out how to engage with them, how to make it, they want to walk away and think, wow, I really want that person as a colleague. Right? It's not that they want to walk away and think that they've interrogated you and you've passed. It's that they want to have fun. They want to think, this is a person I'm going to benefit from having around the department. They're curious about my research. They're curious about the community. They're just engaged individuals. And so some of the time that comes out is during that dinner. The other thing you can pick up on there is you can learn a lot about the dynamics of the faculty at the school, right? Because every school, when they're interviewing, is putting on a show. And so, so you have to figure out how to get the information that would actually be useful to you out of that show. And part of that is figuring out what the natural dynamic is and how that fits with you. The other thing I would say is Duke chemistry has the first interview as a single day. And so we cut out a lot of things like seeing space. It's important to see there's potential space. And we cut out meeting with students. And so then on the second visit, if you get a second visit, you sort of have to ask for those things. And that's when you get them. So, so I tended not to be, I tended not to push a desire to meet with students on the first interview, or really request anything in particular because it's their show. But on the second interview, if I had sort of checked off all the boxes, that was a great time to do it. Meeting one-on-one with faculty is what most of the rest of the day is filled with. Sometimes including meetings about benefits, because some schools put that on the first interview. And there your job is basically to engage with another human being about their science and your science and anything you really want to. But the whole day, one of the challenges of a day or 2 days of visits is that every single interaction you have is potentially informing a decision somebody else will make. But it's also potentially informing the decision you will make. And so you have to figure out how to get whatever information you want and also be the most charming, wonderful version of yourself.
Keep in mind that the people you're meeting with might not have had time to come to your interview, like to your job talk. So be prepared to have, the 3-minute spiel of this is what I do. Like, don't really sit and walk through your whole job talk again for them, but be prepared to tell them, have a little spiel of this is what I'm working on. Because a lot of times, they might have been teaching. It's not that they weren't interested in coming to to your talk, but a lot of the faculty members don't end up making it to all the job talks. But you still need to kind of bring them up to speed.
Yeah, I guess my biggest impression was it would be to second the marathon nature of it, right? Different schools do different things, but I had schools where I would travel, right? So that's a tough way to start, you know, airports and delays and these kinds of things. That night you have usually drinks and then a dinner. The next morning you give your seminar, meet with people all through the day, another dinner. And then some schools would do the chop talk the next morning, and then meetings all day and dinner, and then you go home. Right? So I did that in a couple schools. So that's a lot of time to be on, right? To be charming and to be intelligent, right? And you really can't take time off and just be like, look, buddy, I'm just gonna zone out through this. And you'll have a huge range. You'll have people who are like, I really liked your talk, let's talk about your science, which is one of the easier ones. You have people who want to make small talk. You have people who are like, oh, I think you'd be really interested in seeing this, and like turn around their computer screen and are like, we did this and this and this, and here's our Western blots, and what do you think of this? So you've got to be prepared for that. I think, again, a point that came up, which is a really good one, is they're hiring you, right? Your research program and what you bring to the table scientifically is a big part of that. But there's plenty of people who have beautiful science with perfect CVs that don't get jobs because they can't carry a conversation, they can't make eye contact with somebody. And faculty have, I mean, I haven't been here that long, but even in my short time, you have a ton of interactions with your colleagues, right? You're on committees, you have to figure out graduate student recruitment. I mean, there's all kinds of things. Bring speakers in. So if they don't feel like they can work with you, or if it's going to be a chore, right? If you're going to be the person who will never show up on time or won't give good comments or something, this is a huge part of the interview process. And so I think it's hard, right? If you don't have any interpersonals, because I don't know how you like fake that for the interview. But I would say be genuine and don't only think about the science. Yeah. And something that I felt really helped my interactions with faculty was to be legitimately kind of in the moment and involved in my discussions with them. Right? So our department, MGM, has a huge range of people that I interviewed with, right? I'm a virologist, so they have a core group of people who study viruses, and those were easy meetings for me. But then we have a bunch of people who do yeast genetics, right? DNA repair in yeast. And that's about as far from my stuff as you can get. And I think you do yourself a disservice, and I think it makes it harder for you to remain engaged if you're like, oh crap, I gotta meet with this yeast guy, right? But if you go into it like, look, you know, these guys have a different skill set, they think about problems differently than I do, I can potentially get something out of this. And it's also good to know, you know, in the faculty who are the most removed from your potential research program, are you still going to be able to interface with them? Are you still going to be able to give something to them and take something for yourself? I think that's an important thing for you to know, outside of also trying to impress them, because they have the same concerns about you.
I will add one thing, which is that since it is sort of potentially a marathon, it can feel like you're asking the same questions over and over. And to avoid that feeling, what you can do is come up with different questions depending on career stage or research area that are open enough so that the conversations can diverge.
So what if you are asked an illegal question like, oh, do you have kids, or oh, is your spouse looking for a job as well? How do you?
I don't know. I don't know that is entirely bad, because in some of our cases we brought couples here, and that actually was helpful, because then you can start thinking, oh, if we really like this person, then we should be able to get something for the spouse. So I don't know if it's entirely bad, but It comes up usually in the dinner, doesn't it?
Yeah, that question pretty much comes up
Yeah.
everywhere, although not as directly, so it's not always technically legal.
Yeah.
And it's hard, like I had that where I had, like we were trying to get my husband a position or I wasn't going to take the job in that city. And it was kind of hard to decide at which interviews, at what stage to bring that up. Because for me, it really was going to be a deal breaker. And I did have schools try to ask, like, try to get around asking it and say nicely, but like, one of the deans was like, the reason I'm trying to ask is like, we want to start working now so that he has a position by the time you have to make a decision on our offers.
Yeah.
If I waited to tell them till I had the offer and I had 2 weeks or something to respond, they wouldn't be able to do anything.
That's right.
So it's kind of I wouldn't necessarily recommend bringing it up, in that first interview, but if you get called back for the second interview, that's something, if it's a deal breaker for you, that's worth considering. I tended to bring it up often in the second interview. I don't know if it was just, sometimes I brought it up in the first interview. If it was really, like, if it was a school, I would only come because we both got a job in the same city. I brought it up early. But it's really, in my case, it's because it really was a deal breaker situation. So I don't know how to respond when you get asked something completely different.
Yes.
I mean, I tried to take kind of the open book approach and figure that, they're going to know. I mean, I guess I don't know what's a really, anything that they're potentially concerned about. I guess in my mind, I was also had thought about types of things, like I had a brand new baby at the time I was into it, right? And so when these things would come up, it wasn't that I wanted to hide that I had a baby and it would influence my ability to work long hours or whatever. So if it came up, they'd be like, oh, do you have a family? I'd be like, yeah, we just had this baby and, it's been tough getting into lab as much as I used to, but, my wife and I figured out this and we have this plan, and just kind of made it in the informal conversation. So it wasn't, but I guess I hadn't been asked anything that may have been in a gray area, I had already thought about myself, and so I felt like I had an answer for, and I was willing to volunteer that information to potentially minimize their concerns.
I felt like whenever they were asking, it was usually to help you. Like we had a few women's lunches on my interviews, and then they wanted to ask about kids, but their point was they wanted to make sure I knew how supportive they were and what options there were in the school, and they were really bringing it up just so that I knew it was possible at that school to have children and still continue. So it was always just brought up in a positive way, like they wanted to make sure you knew how they supported it. I've never been in a position where it was a negative side.
There were a couple times when I chose not to answer that question. So when people are bringing up a question that is maybe not at face value, but is effectively a question they're not supposed to ask, right? You never know how it influences decisions on their end. And so it is frequently phrased in a way where you actually don't have to answer it, right? You can respond to another question that is similar. You can deflect and ask whoever is talking to you about their life, oh, what have you found? You can do all sorts of things like that. And there were a couple places where the people asking me were not, it wasn't a group of people where I thought, oh, you're clearly asking to provide me with information and support. It was more like, wow, you're the stereotype of someone who shouldn't ask me that question. So I'm going to try to change the topic. And that worked fine. It didn't seem to impact the outcome of any of my decisions. I know people who take off their rings when they go to interview because they don't want it to be a factor. And I know people who are really open about it, about what the role of family is in their lives. And so I think what you probably want is to come up with responses that you're comfortable with, right? It's not, there's no one right answer. It's a sticky area, that's why we're doing it.
Yeah, from the point of view of recruitment, at least from our department, we don't, that's not a negative at all. So, it's like, it's not like in the 20 years ago, it's totally, or more, yeah, it's totally different. Actually, it might be even a plus. to have somebody that, has multitasking ability.
So it sounds like you all went on lots of interviews. Is it appropriate to let them know that you're interviewing elsewhere? Do you kind of dangle that like, oh.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, because if you were not interested in a candidate or marketable, then you wouldn't have places to go, and that would be a minus. So it's better to know that you really have a lot of options.
Yeah, I don't think you want to be like, oh, and by the way, last week I was at Harvard, or whatever, right? But it always comes up, people are like, oh, have you been to other places? And they want to know, right? So you can almost kind of play coy, and be like, yeah, I've been to a bunch of schools, like, I've been to some schools, and they'll follow up, they'll be like, oh really, how'd it go? Like, these types of things. So, but I don't know, at least, I think all fields, certainly in my field, it's a small world, right? And everybody knows everybody, so they pretty much know. You certainly don't want to lie, right? You certainly don't want to be like, I've been to 25 schools. But I think it comes out, and I think most of the times they know. So I think just honesty, and if they ask you, they will ask you, and just be on the table with them. One thing you don't want to do is ever talk badly about a school. And certainly, I don't know if you guys had this experience, but I had some places that I interviewed, and within the first, 3 hours there, I was like, nope. And there's just places that have different things and different kind of cultures that may not appeal to you at all. But for all you know, the school you really like, that chairman's best friends with the chairman of the school that you don't like, right? And so, I think it's fine to say, I've been to these schools, I'm really excited about, focus on the positive, right? Like, I'm really excited about this opportunity, like the opportunity that you're, the school that you're at. But I would never be like, oh yeah, but I went to this school and it was horrible. Just focus on the positive.
Because they might think that you may say the same about that school when you go somewhere else.
Yeah.
I was asked like explicitly, where have you interviewed, and like that was the questions I felt most uncomfortable with, was like trying to know exactly where. But then they did ask, how do you think about this, or like our school versus the other schools? And especially if they know you're getting offers at the other schools, you have to be careful. Like I got to a position where you kind of wanted to be negative about the other school, but you don't. Like you want to make them clear that like, yes, I might be getting an offer at this other school, but I still really like your school, and these are like focus back on the benefits of what's going on, because you don't want to make them think it's a lost cause at that point as well. So it's kind of a balance of make sure you know the positive things to say, but always follow up with the positive things about the school that you're at. And because I had people ask like outright, why would you pick our school over the other school? And you need to have an answer to that. But,
That's honest.
yeah.
Yeah.
And also not a fantasy answer. Right? They know a lot of others. I would add 2 points to this. One is you also never want to say anything negative about the places you've been. You can say, here are some strengths, here are some limitations, but when I'm talking to someone, if they're telling me all about how horrible their graduate advisor was in this way or that way, what I'm hearing is 10 years from now, I'm projecting to 10 years from now when they leave our school and they talk about how horrible their experience as a faculty member at Duke was. Right, so anytime you're saying negative things about a place, there's another way to say it. Right, it could be, I really learned a lot from that, and some of the things that I'm going to take with me are this and this and this and this. Right, but you want to color things in a positive way, because this is my dream job, right? And all you need is one interview to have a place where you can feel like this could be my dream job, right? So you have to sort of keep that in mind as you're thinking about the marathon. It's easy to get caught up in.
And the other thing to keep in mind is that the people you're interviewing with, even if you choose not to go to that school, especially if they're near your field, those potentially could be the people writing the letters for your tenure 5 years later. So you want to make it, like, it's a great time to make a good impression on them just on that side, but they'll also remember you if you make a negative impression. So just keep in mind, like, even if you don't go to that school, they will still have an impact on your career later.
Oh, that's what you say.
Or, right, you're going to submit grants, you're going to submit papers.
Yeah.
There are people in your field, so.
So that would be the ones with a lot of memories.
Right.
Any questions from the audience at this point? Stefan?
During the Chalk Talk sort of discussion, you guys were making a big deal about distinguishing yourself from your old lab. I guess I kind of come from a different system where it's encouraged to keep in touch with your old lab and what can they do for you when you're striking it out on yourself. Is this a very broad American thing that you've got to be your own island?
I don't think it's being an island so much as, I mean, and it's certainly encouraged, right? The lab I came from, he's the leader in the field, right? So of course you want to maintain connections and have a conduit for reagents and ideas and these types of things. It's more understanding how you're going to go forward and how they're going to go forward and how those are going to go like this as opposed to go like this, right? Because you don't need two labs that do the exact same thing. So I don't think it's so much saying, and I'll never talk to this person again. It's more saying, you know, my research is going in one way and I think that we can both coexist because that's what they want to know.
Yeah, they want to see that you can get your own independent grant, and like that they're not going to be on every publication that you have in the next 10 years. So even just being able to say, like, this is the first grant I would write on my own. Even if you're going to continue to collaborate with them, you need to be able to have your independent grant.
That's right. Because here, for example, I'm also in NIH review panels for grant funding, and the first thing that they ask when you submit your own independent out-of-line grant is this person independent from the person that they train with? And if you're not, chances are that you probably won't get a grant. So you have to show at least 1 or 2 papers that are from your own, not from your mentor's lab. So that is very important. But having contact with your mentor is critical because that person is going to be the one writing letters for all these awards. Like when you first go into your own lab, as a junior faculty, you have a chance to get a huge number of awards that are not just, that are independent awards like MacArthur or all these other awards. And the person writing the letter will be your mentor. So you want to make sure that you keep in touch and that they are engaged in your career. Like in the case of my mentor's mentor, David Baltimore, one of his points of pride is to see that people that he trained are the leaders all over across the country and around the world, and that he has people that are members of the National Academy just like he was. So that's really important.
Another question? Yes.
So one thing that people tend to really emphasize is this idea of when you're presenting, you know, especially in the Chalk Talk realm, this hypothesis-driven kind of research program. Now I know that, you know, you don't want to put out things that are like a fishing expedition, but there are things that are kind of inherently, you know, towards that, you know, building combinatorial libraries or potentially building a platform for X, Y, or Z. At what point, how do you, I mean, do you just try to focus those things on specific problems? Do you kind of present it as this and then focus it? Could you guys kind of maybe comment on how you kind of think about those types of systems? Or
yeah, so I'll back up just a moment and say that Chalk Talk is its own kind of beast. It's not necessarily that it's hard, it's different than probably any kind of talk that you've been used to giving. And I can tell you when I was preparing for my first Chalk Talk, I made an outline on a piece of paper that said, here's the points I want to hit, you know, and I have these 3 areas. And another faculty member, when I was a postdoc, was like, you should really get like a whiteboard and just write it out, you know, and say it out loud. And I was like, you know, I have it outlined, I'm good to go. And she was like, seriously, you should do that. And so she sat down and I got one, and I started writing. Or actually I didn't start writing, I started talking. And it had been like 4 minutes. And she stopped me, she's like, there's nothing on the board. Right, because now, because you're talking like this, but you have to turn and write, and you can't talk while your back's to them. So it's almost kind of a dance, right? Figuring out what you want to say, when you want to write, how big you want to write, right? Are you going to erase your board halfway through? Even where to put things. So the first time I finally started writing my aims, I was like aim 1, 2, 3 on top of each other. And then I had no area to flesh them out, right? So I ended up putting aim 1, aim 2, aim 3 across the board, and then the details underneath them. So these types of things that aren't intuitive about how you would give it logistically, you know what you want to say, but if you just stand there and talk, no one's going to follow you. And I actually interviewed at one place where there was 3 of us and we all went in a row.
Oh, no.
And when I came in, this person hadn't erased their board yet, and they had a diagram of a virus on like a 16-foot whiteboard, right? They had a diagram of a virus. And I was like, oh, that didn't go well. Because, you know, you're basically entertaining them with a whiteboard marker. They call it chalk talk, but I never used it.
Yeah.
Well, you're entertaining them with whiteboard marker for an hour. And by the end of it, that board should be filled and people should have followed it. You should have diagrams and words. And so I ended up, after that spectacular practice failure, I got an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and I did it mini, right? Saying it to myself, writing it, drawing pictures, figuring out, and then you can essentially just scale that. But it really is something that I would say practice a lot before you go, because you've already made the first cut. Now this is where you kind of seal the deal. So that's really important, to know that you don't know how to do it. Because you're good at giving PowerPoint talks, right? I mean, you've given a ton of them, and the stuff's there. And you point to it, and you hit next. You don't have to turn, I mean...
Yeah, that's a good point. In some institutions, including our department, we have sometimes allowed the person to go in before the shop talk starts, and they can start by putting some information on the board. But that doesn't happen everywhere. So that's a good point. And the other thing is that there may be even a further problem in that some of the faculty may not have gone to your first PowerPoint talk. So the first time that they will be hearing everything is in the shop talk. So you have to make sure that they see the big picture. So maybe using diagrams, maybe important, some simple diagrams that they can follow where they can see where your research is flowing and how it intersects with each other.
So I think these are a lot of really important points, but it sounded to me like you were asking a slightly different question. It sounded to me, which is not, I think you guys did a great job of answering some questions that you could have been asking. So I could be wrong, but it sounded to me like you were asking a little bit about how to deal with the content of proposals in a way that focuses them so they are hypothesis driven, even if to some extent they're screening. Is that the question you?
Yeah,
Okay.
a little bit, or at least how do you convey that?
Yeah,
when
and
you're...
for me, that's a little bit of a proposal level question. It is effectively when you're sitting down writing a proposal or thinking about how to talk about it, you need to crystallize in your mind, what is it that I uniquely bring to this? What is the concept that I am bringing to this that not just Joe Schmo who has the same combinatorial library could bring to this? And sometimes the way to focus that is on an application, so that was one example you gave. Sometimes the way to focus that is on invention of a new technology within the context of that library, or whatever the screening mode is. And sometimes it's with a strategy for applying the technology that already exists. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so when you're thinking about how to even pitch your proposals to begin with, you want to think, if somebody's reading this, what's the biggest criticism they could give me in terms of saying I'm exactly like Joe and Jamie and whoever else I come up with. What's the biggest criticism they could give me? And how do I push this science further? What is it I'm adding to this science? And how do I articulate that as a hypothesis? And once you know the answer to that question, it becomes a lot easier to put together a meaningful chalk talk anyway, because you know what your special feature is. There was a workshop, an NIH writing workshop that I went to, where they kept referring to this as the special sauce, which I thought was sort of a funny way to do it. But the question was, you know, what's the salad dressing you're bringing to your salad, right? Is this like a Caesar salad? Is this a vinegar, oil and vinegar salad? What is it that, what's the ingredient you brought that makes this salad different from all other salads?
Yes.
It goes well what they were saying of like, you have to assume people might not have seen your original talk. So you spend, like I spent the first 5 minutes explaining why I'm special, what I'm bringing. And then it sets up, then like for one of the chalk talks, I just walked through, these would be my first 2 grants. These are the 3 aims for the first 2 grants. But then you gave them that context in the first 5 minutes. And you're really, you know, I had one person even comment that like what you're putting out there is kind of audacious, but then they really liked that and you kind of made it seem, it's okay to push and try to do something a little out there and crazy because they want to be known for like groundbreaking science. They want that in their department. But you want to make it seem tractable, like this is why I can accomplish that.
And you can definitely do screens or fishing expeditions, but that should not be the primary goal. So in other words, when you either present a talk, a chalk talk, or write a grant, you can start certainly with some sort of hypothesis, something that is going to move the field forward, a breakthrough question, one of those big innovative things that if you happen to be applying for those grants in the NIH. And then you want to say, and I will develop a new technology, but that would be part of it, an aim. It would be in service of some aim. So for example, sometimes people put the first aim something that is doable, and the second one is breaking new ground, and the third one will be like completely innovative and novel and that kind of thing. So that way, you don't, if something doesn't go well, your entire grant doesn't fall down.
Yeah, you basically have to do it all. You have to, but
Good luck.
seriously, you have to show in the short term that you have things that are definitely going to work, and you're definitely going to get a couple papers, right? Because they need to know that you're going to be able to do that and get your first grant. So that's kind of the boring, we've seen this, we're going to do this, and everyone says, oh yeah, that will definitely work. And then you have to say in the medium term, here's then extensions of that which are cooler, but are going to take more time to develop. And then also long term, you know, we're going to cure every virus infect, right? Like things that have like big picture potential. But if you focus only on the huge, you know, questions, they're going to say, how is that tractable? We don't want someone to come in here and spend 5 years trying to develop new systems and not do anything. You also don't want somebody who's going to come in and propose, here's the protein I'm interested in. I'm going to change 1 amino acid at a time through the whole thing, because they're like, we don't care about that, right? So you kind of do have to span the gamut.
I think like one other thing just to comment on is when we're throughout the whole process is like everyone on the interview committee is from different fields, different areas. So you do need to make sure you're pitching each of these talks at a higher level, like that anyone with a scientific background can kind of understand. But in the individual meetings is when I had people really get into like, okay, now how what's your boundary condition? Let's sit down and do some math and that kind of thing. But in the job talks and the chalk talks, you want to make sure it's kind of at the level of what you would expect to put in a proposal where people from all different backgrounds might be reviewing it.
You can basically picture your department and think of the person who's furthest away from your research in your department, and then imagine explaining it to them. And imagine explaining it to them at the same time as you're explaining it to, I don't know, your mentor or the guy who works right next to you. And the way you have to explain it is something that works for both of these people as well as all of you. On some level.
You definitely have to pick the level at which you want to present it, right? But you also have to be prepared to go into way more detail, because sometimes that comes up. Sometimes somebody will be like, well, how do you know that system's going to be tight enough to not have, leaky experiment or whatever? So you want to know what you want to present, but if they take you in that direction, your answer can't be like, I don't know, we'll figure it out. It can be like, this is exactly what I'm going to do. and then get back to the level that you want to continue with the rest of your time.
Like in the job talk itself, I got feedback for like in the middle of 5 minutes, everyone kind of expects to get lost and they want to see that you can go deep, you can go into the details, but you have to make sure you come back out and bring them all back in and like on an if they can attach to. But like it's okay to have a small section in the middle where you do lose some people and you can show and demonstrate how deep you can go with it. But you need to make sure you're bookending it with pieces that anyone from any level can understand.
So different schools do different things too in terms of how much they're going to challenge you. And some of it's just based on personnel, and some places it's on purpose.
Yeah.
But they will ask you, like a gotcha question, or try and continue to get you off vein, to see if you can refocus and answer questions. And sometimes someone will give you a question like, all right, theoretically, if this other system existed where none of this applied, but like these kinds of questions, and sometimes it seems adversarial. I certainly gave chalk talks where it seemed like I had adversaries in the audience, and I don't think that was their intention. I think it was more seeing how you could handle a challenge. So if that happens, and it frequently does, you have to kind of not get defensive. I think that's the worst thing that you can do.
Okay, that's right. Yeah, and it seems that you, depending on the lab in which you train, you may have been accustomed to be like very easy questions. And I actually, on the other hand, was in a lab where the training was like, very more challenging, and I like that because I don't like for people to tell me how great the data is. I want people to tell me where the potential problems are, so that way I can be prepared. So when you go to meetings, you can actually answer the questions correctly. So you may find that at some places you have that kind of more adversarial, but I find that to be probably most helpful. But some people may not.
And they are aware, like I had multiple schools where before I gave my talk, they're like, just so you know, there are a couple people that are going to sit in the back and they're going
Or on the front.
Yeah. And they know who they are, they're aware of it, and they're doing it to every other candidate, so you don't feel like they're just attacking you.
It's worthwhile to think of what you would say in advance if someone said basically, I think your field is worthless. Convince me that it's not. And do it in a way that holds your ground, but and isn't defensive, but is open to actually acknowledging that I just said your field was worthless. Right? Because I did actually get that question multiple times, which is a funny thing when you're faced with it. The other thing is, I do think that schools want to see you both listen and be able to assert what your understanding of the world is, right? And so I did have, I think my favorite disruption to a talk was someone in the middle claiming that I was wrong and seeing how, just like shouting it out, and seeing how I responded to that. So weird things will happen, and it's just a question of remembering everybody there wants you to thrive, right? Even if they're challenging you, it's coming from a place of, just assume it's coming from a place of someone wants you to thrive. Whether or not that's true is
Did you end up getting an offer at that school?
Yeah. And I responded respectfully, but I was like, no, this is what it sounds like you're saying. This is what is actually true. I can see where there might be some misunderstanding. We're going to move forward. That was effectively how
So that's very good.
It was a good, it was, I'm very proud of that particular moment, but yeah.
Yes.
How is the format different for small liberal arts schools? More emphasis on teaching philosophy or something else? I don't know.
So I'm going to feel that.
I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't know.
So small liberal arts schools each have, the ones I interviewed at, each had a different format. And so you have to ask them in advance what their format is. Some will have you prepare a lecture on a topic of their choosing that is supposed to be a course lecture in the middle of the course. And I found that really challenging. You want to make sure you actually have time and take time to practice that with real human beings in front of you. There was one case where I didn't get to, and that was sad for me. Other schools will say, we want you to give a summary of your previous research and a summary of your proposed research, both within the same 45-minute talk. And so when you're merging those two things, you have to be very careful to think about how you're teaching and who your audience is. At a liberal arts college, I know for a fact there were faculty members not from the same department at most things that I did. So there was one example where there was an economist in the audience who was expecting to be able to understand the chemistry that I was talking about. And the only reason I found that out was because I made the talk interactive. So they said, at this particular school, they said, you have 45 minutes. We want you to take about 10 of those minutes and give us the foundation that we need to understand your actual research. You don't have to talk about all of it, but some subset of it. And use that to move into your future research. And that's a real challenge because suddenly you have to give people enough depth to be able to feel like they understand what's going on, at least in a big picture way. So I made the initial teaching portion basically an interactive, partially flipped classroom. So I put up some background and then I had problem examples. And I said, work on each of these on your own. And I literally went around the room and interacted with people while they were doing this, which is how I found out there was an economist. They don't tell you this in advance, right? And my bet is that that's actually why I got that offer, that they could see that I was really enjoying that teaching portion, and that they all left feeling like they understood, right? So I wasn't talking down to them. I was trying to get them to engage with something that I really love. And so what I was projecting was, I love this stuff, and here are the fundamentals so that you can understand at least the basics of what's going on. So that's an example of how things can differ at liberal arts colleges. But it's a pretty dramatic difference. And so you basically have to ask, what's the format and what do you want me to present every time? And it's different every time. So.
From the example that you just gave, one thing that I forgot to mention that is important at all, I'm sure not just at liberal arts, but also at all institutions, is that you have to show that you're really enthusiastic and invested in your work. Because we've had some really very impressive candidates come by on paper, but when they went and presented the talk, it was so boring. And they looked like they really were not invested. I mean, they may have been, but it just didn't come through. So I think that's really important. Like, it's a very important factor.
That's something to be really careful with at the end of the interview process, because I feel like by the end I was very sick of talking about myself and talking about my work, and like kind of just wanted to ask more questions from other people. Like when you've given that talk 15 times, yeah, figure out ways to make it more exciting and innovative for you to be able to get back into it, because you don't want to mess up your last interview because it's just kind of you repeating the same words over and over.
So the theme here would be, hopefully you love what you do. You shouldn't be trying to go after one of these jobs for any other reason. And you need to communicate that through who you are when you're on an interview. By engaging with other human beings. And they're not like automatons trying to interview. They're people who come from whatever place they come from. And you're allowed to ask questions, right? We're giving you very broad answers as to what things are like, but everything is fairly field specific. And for liberal arts colleges, everything is very school specific. So the things that are common are have a good attitude, figure out what's special about you, and make sure to be able to communicate that, and then listen and figure out what's special about the other people at the other end of the conversation, and be receptive to that.
So jumping ahead a little bit, when are are startup budgets, salary discussed? Does that happen during the interview, or does that happen after you get what? After you get the offer?
It depends on the school. So for me, there were some schools that actually asked for a budget before I went. For liberal arts colleges, you should have numbers in mind, and you should be able to mentally scale them depending on the size of the program, because the smaller the school, the more the budget may impact the decision-making process, and you need to be able to figure out what's reasonable. But I always went with a budget in mind, and in some instances, there was one instance where the end of the first day, the chair of the department sat me down and said, so show me your budget. And I showed it to him, and he said effectively, oh, I bet we can cut this. But I had such a detailed budget that had sort of line items for specific things that were going to be purchased that went into this. He then looked up some of those specific things on their system. He was sure their discount was going to be better than whatever my estimate had been, and it consistently was not, which meant that he knew he had to go out there and try to get more money if they, not a lot more, right? I was within 50K of where they wanted me to be, but he knew we had this 50K gap, and that my estimates were precise. Right? So it's useful to go in with a very detailed understanding of what you think you'll need. And the reason I was able to do that in spite of all of the things that are going on around you while you're applying is because I knew other people who had applied, and because I had already done a bunch of ordering for the labs I had been in. And so I was able to take things people had put together before and know roughly what I needed to adjust.
Yeah, I had that, I had it also at the first day of one of the interviews, the last meeting with the chair, and they wanted to know my budget. So you kind of, you want to go in prepared to be able to talk about it. And I also had it informally throughout the day and a lot of the one-on-ones, because for me, I need to do large scale computing. They wanted to know, we don't have those resources here. How would you do that? What would be required to let you come? Because they want to know immediately, if we're not going to be able to buy this, we're not going to continue forward. So you need to have just at least a rough idea of what you're going to need, how much it's going to cost, and how they would do it. And you can ask, I ran my budgets by my advisors, I ran by professors at other institutions to get advice. You can get input from that if you don't know, because I didn't know initially how much a cluster would cost, so just kind of ran it by people from different schools and got feedback on that.
Yeah, in my case, I actually just asked people that were interviewing around the same time, that were in a similar field as mine, and then I just got what they had, and then that's what I had. But I was not really asked about that until the second visit.
Yeah, in my experience, all my interviews, it was one of two things. After the second interview, when they decided that they wanted you, they either said, here's our general startup package, right? And if you have any different requirements, let's talk about it. Some schools said, tell us what you need, and plan on running your lab for 4 years. So what do you need to buy all your equipment and run it, reagents, and these types of things. So regardless of how it's presented to you, especially if you have to justify it, it becomes incredibly helpful for you to, you can walk around your current lab, right, and say, okay, we need a -80-degree freezer, we need an incubator, we need all these things, right? And you go through and you put prices with them all and you tally it up. You can find out what it costs to pay a technician or a postdoc or these things, salary, and there's extra stuff like fringe benefits that may not exist, but that makes it more expensive. So then you come to a number, right? And I think it's always, at least I shot high, because you don't want to say, here's the number that I really need, and the chair go, oh, okay, that's easy, done. You want to be like, oh, okay, that's a little high, and meet in the middle. But you have to justify it, because the numbers that are thrown at you are big numbers, right? But you don't know, right? If somebody says, we'll give you $1 million, that sounds like a lot. But maybe you need $2 million, right? And until you've actually done the math, not only do you not know, but you have no way to justify. You can't just be like, oh, also I want more than that. And they're like, why? Yeah, because more is better. Yeah, so, but it's not adversarial. They want you to be successful. They want you to be able to do what you're proposing to do. They also don't want to overpay for you. So, you know, I didn't have any problems coming to a realistic, you know, acceptable compromise.
My approach was to remember that what both of us want, what everybody involved wants, is for my research program to thrive, or for my, whatever, for my existence to thrive at this institution. And so I needed to know, they're not going to know what it's going to take to make that happen. So I needed to know how to argue about, or how to articulate what I thought it would take to make my program thrive. Because they don't know, they have a ballpark figure in mind usually. And it scales with the schools, so I had different budgets depending on the size of the school.
Public schools and private schools will be different.
Yeah, and even the cost of a student changes across schools, so that's the other reason to make it detailed, is that you may get into a room and you're saying, well, I think I need this, but let's talk about what these costs actually are. And places can vary dramatically. Duke likes to give you a pot of money with no strings attached. And so you can basically negotiate for the pot of money, and you're sort of describing why you need that pot. But other schools will say, okay, we'll give you X number of RA slots, and we'll give you X number of TA slots. And so that money isn't actually money that we're putting into your contract. That's billets for students. And so you do need to have flexibility when you get to that point.
And in some cases, you might need a special type of equipment that is very high-end and that it changes very rapidly. So like, for example, a mass spec machine, or some kind of very specialized fax machine, or some kind of supercomputer or something. So you really need to, if that is the case, you really need to make sure that you let them know from the beginning. And in my case, the second interview was important because you want to see the space. And in some cases, the space may need a lot of remodeling. So you don't want to go to a place where you're going to be like in a very bad space, not surrounded by right type of faculty, colleagues. So you want to make sure, like some departments in some universities are split through multiple buildings, and some buildings are better than others, and some faculty are associated with centers that are thriving and some other faculty are not. So you really want to know where you're going to end up before you commit to anything.
And ask the faculty, like I had a lot of faculty members on the one-on-one interviews that were like, you know, if you decide to go forward with like negotiating this, like they were willing to give you feedback on their negotiations at that school, and they gave feedback even on like, you know, don't get in this building. Just things you wouldn't pick up on, but it was useful. It was very useful to know.
Other questions?
How many interviews did you have during the year you got hired? And how did you schedule the interviews? How many did you have per week, per month?
I only picked like 6 interviews, and then I ended up going to all of those multiple times. Some of them up to even 3 times to decide. And I usually go in a period of about 7 months, 6 to 7 months. I did all the traveling, so it would be like maybe 2 per month, something like that.
Yeah, I think I had like 7 or 8, and it was in between January and maybe March, April time frame, and then you had to come back for more, so that's kind of ridiculous. One thing I did that was helpful, because I'm very interdisciplinary, so I'm applying in all different departments, so as soon as I got an interview at a school I was really interested in, if I'd applied to multiple departments, I would tell the other department. So like for Duke, I interviewed both in computer science and BME on the same visit, so that was helpful. I did, like, sometimes I had a 2-week stretch where I went to California. I was living in Boston. I was in California, I went home to Boston for 2 days, and immediately back at the same school in California the next week. And it just kind of happens. You try to spread them out because you don't want to be tired and exhausted. I don't have any great advice for how you schedule interviews. It's just.
No, I just said whatever is most convenient for you.
Yeah.
Right. Spacing them out would definitely be helpful, because it takes a mental toll
Do
Yeah.
not have 2 in 1 week. That
No.
would be bad.
Try not to have multiples in the week.
I had 3 1 week. So that was a really bad idea. I was nearly crying by the time I finished that. Just like so tired of exhaustion. So in my field, there's a compressed schedule. You don't have a lot of choices. When they offer you a date, you take the date. You could basically do 2 in a week, and so that's what I was doing for a good period of time. And in my field, liberal arts colleges tend to interview, and smaller research institutions tend to interview a little earlier, in part because there's something called an exploding offer. They give you an offer and you have a period of time by which you need to respond. So for some smaller schools, that period is as short as a week. Actually, that was pretty typical. And so for some of the smaller schools, they really need a faculty member that year for teaching reasons or whatever reasons. And so they'll interview earlier, make the offer earlier, and the saying is that a bird in the hand is better than 2 in the bush. And so a lot of people will just take those offers. And so you have to sort of follow the schedule as it is most of the time. So I actually got to the point by the end of that first period of interviewing where my postdoc mentor said, "You've been on vacation a lot," and took away my holiday vacation, right? Because I had been on vacation so much. So you want to be careful to communicate really effectively with your mentor about what's going on. He then didn't remember doing that, and so after the time had passed, he was confused about why I hadn't gone on vacation.
And you do want to do things like, they always say like it's not a good idea to schedule your favorite school and your top choice for your first interview. Like use one as a practice if at all possible. But then you want to try to schedule the ones you're more interested in early. Because like I got offers when I know they hadn't interviewed everybody yet in the whole pool. So it's good to try to be some of the earlier ones. And even by the end, there were some schools where I was debating canceling the interviews because I was so excited about the previous schools.
Yeah.
So having kind of front loading the ones you're really interested in can be good. But if at all possible, don't have your top choice be the first interview to get that experience. And if you don't have that option, you can always schedule, like just go visit another school and ask if you can, odds are you or your advisor know somebody at another school nearby, even if it's like, go have a visit day at UNC and just practice meeting with people and kind of go through a fake interview just to know what you're going through before you don't want to have your top choice be the first time you do it.
And by the way, when you prepare your job doc and chalk doc, make sure that it's practiced with members of your lab, members of other labs that are not exactly in your field, so that way you're prepared to get all the problems out of the park and make it understand.
So I have one more comment, which is channeling myself when I was about to interview. I was petrified that I wouldn't get any interviews because I knew people who hadn't gotten any interviews who were really excellent scientists. And it happens for one reason or another. We've obviously all been really lucky. But all it takes is one school to interview to get the job. Right? So I have a friend who is thriving. He has a thriving research program. He loves his group. He is really happy at the school he's at. And that school had interviewed the candidates they were thinking about interviewing, and had one of the faculty members randomly ran into our old mentor and said, "Hey, do you know anybody who we should be interviewing? Because this search so far has failed and we're going back for another round." And our old mentor said, "Oh, you've got to interview this person. He's fabulous." Right, so it seemed from where he was sitting, he was thinking, I'm going to have to ask for another postdoc. I'm going to have to apply for a different position. And sort of at the last minute, he got this opportunity, which has been a golden opportunity. So if you are sitting in a place where you're concerned about, I'm not going to get any interviews, that's entirely possible, right? But it's not, one, the end of the world, and it doesn't take however many interviews to get a job. It just takes one. Right.
So it's worth noting, like, I did they have the advanced programs at different schools around the country, and they have like the future faculty workshops. And as part of that, you put your resume in a database saying, I'd like to be faculty member. And I did actually get an interview off of them finding my resume in that database, contacting me and asking me to apply. So they do actually use these. And in some of the other schools, like even Duke, I didn't fit the call that they had, but I contacted the university and said I'd love to be in the B&B department here. I really like it. Are there any options? And I was hired under a call that wasn't published. So it's worth checking if there's a school you really want to be at or a program. Reach out to the chair or other professors you know and just ask what the opportunities are. Because I know a lot of times when you look and you don't see something published or like you don't actually fit exactly what their call says. You don't really want to apply, but you never really know what they're looking for. And a lot of schools do have these unpublished calls going, or if they just see someone fantastic, they'll be able to make room for them. They're open to it. They just need to see your application
And get your mentor to help you figure out how to do that. Because there are a lot of ways to do that well or poorly.
And one of the things is that if you go to meetings in your field, many of the people that are going to be potential hiring in their institutions will be in the audience. So that's what happened to me. So in many cases, I didn't even have to apply. They told me to apply. So it's good to go to the cutting edge type.
Yeah, it definitely happens. A lot of people are hired for jobs that aren't even posted,
Yeah.
right? Because a lot of schools, if they know they want to hire somebody, will reach out to their colleagues and try and come up with a group to look at before they post the job. That's awesome if you find that. The one thing that you might want to be concerned about is timings, right? So frequently those happen early in the fall before, jobs are kind of posted on the academic calendar. So essentially now they're starting to post jobs and through October. And if you go on an interview, in August, right, and you just kill it and they want you, they make you an offer before the deadlines for the other schools, right? And then that can, delaying that if you want to check out your other options can become problematic. So keep that in mind.
Okay, final question, Nishan?
I think you mentioned earlier a little bit about not doing phone interviews. So only the bigger schools only the smaller schools might be doing phone interviews. I was wondering if you had done the phone interview with people.
I did a bunch of them, mostly at smaller schools. I would say that I probably tanked the Research 1 phone interviews. I think they wanted me to not be humble. That didn't work out. In one case. In another case, there were these technical difficulties and it was just a disaster. For phone interviews, I found it a lot easier to do Skype interviews because you can actually see how people are responding to you. You can see who you're talking to. And in preparation for any of these phone interviews, I had a list of questions where I wanted to know the answer, but I also had a list of questions they might ask that I had gotten from somebody who had done phone interviews before. And that allowed me, one, to systematically get to know the school to some extent before I got on the phone or on the Skype call, and two, to figure out how I would potentially fit in there, what I could offer them, what I would want to know. So just literally having thought about it in advance, having sort of thought about how I would respond to questions, I think made a huge difference. Most of those, like I said, were liberal arts colleges, and I got some comments on subsequent in-person interviews with them that, oh, you were the only person who did this or who did that. And usually it was related to having looked up information about the school and actually thought about how will I fit into this environment. Or for the liberal arts colleges, I'm very driven by individual students thriving. Right? To me, you're not teaching a class, you're teaching individuals. You're teaching a group of individuals. And you're not pouring knowledge into them, you're having a back and forth. And so your goal as a faculty member who's teaching, not on the research side, but your goal is on the teaching side is to help someone figure out how to thrive, right? Which is a very amorphous goal. But that understanding that I have, that I've obviously put a lot of thought into, is an understanding that a lot of people haven't come to. And so for liberal arts colleges, professors who have been there for a long time, this is what they know. It's all about the students. It's not about me, right? It's not about me. It's effectively the ultimate service job. And so answering questions naturally with that in mind, being able to connect to people on the other end, to ask them, well, what is it that you want? To say honestly, no, this job would be amazing. I don't know what it is, maybe it wouldn't, but I applied because I'm genuinely interested, and here's what I think I know about you, and here's why I think I'm interested. But I'm hoping you'll educate me as to why I should actually be interested. Right? Being able to take that approach was pretty great. For the Research 1 schools, I have no idea what would have made my phone interviews more successful beyond one, not having a technical disaster on one phone. And for the other case, it's pretty clear to me that if I had answered one of the questions differently, one, it wouldn't have been honest, but two, it probably would have gotten me the interview. And I chose not to do that because I didn't need that.
I had, like, the two Skype calls I had, it seemed they were really trying to see how serious you were about that school.
Yeah.
Like I was asked outright, who would you collaborate, at least like in our department, why are you applying to our school? And you needed to have researched the school beforehand. And it just, they were really using it to see, like, you know, are we your backup, or is it, like, are you seriously looking at us? And being able to talk to the department and what's going on in the school and why they're unique, not just you, is kind of the main focus I have.
Okay, we have reached the end of our time, so let's thank our